Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. Later in the program, I'm going to be interviewing Congressman Kelly Armstrong, who's on for his first open phone, or not, I guess open phones. That's what we used to call it when I did radio. It's not open phones anymore. But first, I guess you want to call it maybe a podcast town hall. We did one last episode with Senator Kramer. He used to come on my radio show where we called them open phones town halls. And we're kind of doing the same thing. I'm going to solicit questions from you, the audience, and then I'll ask these two gentlemen those questions every week when they come on. We'll record the interview, and you can hear the answers to your questions. It's a way to get fairly direct access to them and get information from them. So Congressman Kelly Armstrong, I solicited some questions via social media this week, and you'll hear him answer those questions as well as some questions of my own. And if you want to ask him questions, as a matter of fact, as I record this, I've already got an emailed question for next week. But if you want to, if you're thinking about questions that you want to ask these gentlemen, who are 2/3 of our federal delegation to Washington, D.C., you can email them to me at any time, rob@sayanythingblog.com. Also, by the way, stay tuned at the end of the show. I've been starting to get some feedback on the show, so stay tuned at the end, and I'm going to do a listener feedback section. And I'll read some of your reactions, some of your emails to things that are going on the podcast. So if you've got feedback that you want to get in that way, certainly email that to me as well, rob@sayanythingblog.com. So before we get to any of that, though, I've got a little bit of a rant. And normally I like to keep this podcast very local, very focused on North Dakota. But it's hard for me to ignore what's going on nationally. And what's going on nationally right now is that there's a movement among leftist Democrats, and I'm thinking the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that wing of the National Democratic Party, and they want to abolish billionaires. Ocasio-Cortez's economic policy advisor, he's a guy named Dan Riffle. He actually changed his Twitter name to, quote, "Every billionaire is a policy failure." It's been going out there. Robert Reich, who was the Clinton era labor secretary, who's become sort of a left wing commentator now at this point, he wrote this on Twitter, linking to a New York Times column by Farhad Manjoo, the headline of which was "Abolish Billionaires, a Radical Idea is Gaining Adherents on the Left. It's the Perfect Way to Blunt Tech-Driven Inequality." Robert Reich wrote this on Twitter. He says, I quote, "Anyone who has $1 billion either exploited a monopoly that should have been broken up, got inside information unavailable to other investors, bribed some politicians, or inherited the money from their parents." So this is what they're saying. What they're saying is that having $1 billion is in and of itself a terrible thing. And in the eyes of these people, there is no valid way to have accumulated that level of wealth. That's what they're thinking. I don't know that I necessarily believe that. I could think of billionaires in the world. There's billionaire entertainers in the world. Members of the Beatles come to mind. Paul McCartney, obviously he's a billionaire. His net worth is over $1 billion. Did he get that way by bribing people? Did he get that way by taking advantage of people? Or is he just a super talented person who got there because he's a talented person and he produced music and entertainment that, millions and millions and millions of fans around the world over the course of a multi-decade career have enjoyed? I'm pretty sure that J.K. Rowling, who created the Harry Potter series and all of its spin-offs, the movies, the books, the theme parks, the merchandise, everything else, she's a billionaire. Did she get that way because she cheated people, or is she just talented? I don't begrudge these people their wealth. They got there because they're talented, because they accomplished something that the rest of us couldn't. They gave us all something that we wanted. Now, granted, both of these are entertainers, but you could say the same thing about, say, Facebook. Now, Facebook's been in the news a lot. There's a lot of ugly things to be said about Facebook. I don't know that I don't particularly like Facebook myself. I'm kind of there because when you're in the business that I am, you don't really have a choice. But I don't spend a lot of my time on Facebook. I don't really like Facebook, but there's no denying that Facebook has been revolutionary in terms of how we communicate. Facebook is providing a service for all the negatives that are out there There's a lot of positives about how people stay in touch with one another, how people stay up with one another on birthdays. They look at pictures. They share pictures of their vacations. They can have better access with grandma. I mean, it's a good thing, and they made $1 billion off of it because it's a service that a lot of people wanted. Same with Google. Same with the telecom industry. Cell phones, smartphones, everything else. These things have produced a lot of billionaires. And the reason why is because they have, in turn, provided us with things that we didn't have before. There are people in the United States of America that we consider to be poor. Now, I don't know that they're poor by the standards of another age, but they're perhaps below, what we consider to be the poverty line in 2019 in America, that have a smartphone. A smartphone that they can, for free, communicate with somebody on the other side of the globe. A smartphone that gives them access to just about the entirety of human knowledge. Poor people have this in 2019. I would argue that we have come so far in advancing the cause of prosperity in the United States of America, even as, yes, we have gotten more and more billionaires at the top. We have come so far in evolving economically as a society that poor people in the United States of America have more to fear health-wise from obesity than they do from starvation. Consider that for a moment. A poor person in the United States and America today is more likely to die from a health malady related to obesity than they are from malnourishment or starvation. Now, I'm not saying that going hungry is something that doesn't happen anymore. I'm just saying that being poor today sure as heck ain't like being poor even 30, 40 years ago. And a reason for that is because we've all gotten more affluent. Have the people at the top gotten richer? Sure. But has everybody else gotten richer too? Well, yeah. And as a matter of fact, you don't have to take my word for it. Here's research from the Brookings Institute. I quote, "The majority of humankind is no longer poor or vulnerable to falling into poverty. By our calculations, as of this month, just over 50% of the world's population, or some 3.8 billion people, live in households with enough discretionary expenditure to be considered middle class or rich. About the same number of people are living in households that are poor or vulnerable to poverty, so September 2018 marks a global tipping point. After this, for the first time ever, the poor and vulnerable will no longer be a majority in the world. Barring some unfortunate global economic setback, this marks the start of a new era of a middle-class majority." Consider that. And by the way, for the idea that the rich are getting richer, here's economist Russ Roberts writing, saying that economic mobility is alive and well in the United States. He writes, I quote, "The average income of the top 1% went from $189,000 a year to $843,000 a year, which seems to confirm the view that most of the gains from economic growth go to the richest of the rich, while people in the middle or bottom make no progress at all. But the people in the top 1% in 2014 are not the same people in 1980. What happens when you follow the same people? The richest people in 1980 actually ended up poorer. On average, in 2014, like the top 20%, top 1% in 1980 were also poorer on average 34 years later in 2014. The gloomiest picture of the American economy is not accurate. The rich don't get all the good gains. The poor and middle class are not stagnating. So, let's go back to this idea that billionaires are evil and there's no legitimate way to have become a billionaire. The only way you could have become a billionaire, according to leftist thinkers like Robert Reich, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Bernie Sanders, according to these people, there is no legitimate way to become a billionaire, not without having, broken the law or bribed your way there or taken advantage of other people or what have you. I think that this is inaccurate. I think there's examples. Certainly that happens. Certainly there are people who bribe and cheat and take advantage. That happens in the world, no question, but that happens, I would say, at all income levels. But I think there are legitimate ways to become a billionaire. And also, the idea that somehow being a billionaire, the only way to do that is exploitive, I think is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how the economy works. Misunderstanding one being that somebody having $1 billion does not necessarily mean that there's $1 billion less wealth for the rest of us. When we say that Paul McCartney's net worth is $1.2 billion, it's not because he has $1.2 billion sitting in like a Scrooge McDuck-like vault somewhere that he could dive off a diving board and swim in, like some pile of cash somewhere, or bars of gold. Maybe he's got some of that, I don't know. But a lot of that are probably assets. Think about it this way. When people think about, when they fall into the trap of thinking that somebody having $1 billion in wealth means $1 billion less wealth for the rest of us, I always think about the process of building a house. Now, let's say that you want to build a new house and you have $100,000 budgeted for it, and you spend that $100,000 on material, and I have no idea if that's an appropriate. I'm not a house builder. I don't know. So I'm just making up numbers here, but $100,000, and you buy supplies, and you hire contractors, and they hire subcontractors, and you pay the permits and the fees and everything else. And at the end of that process, if you've done it right, you now have a home. You have an asset, right? And if you've done it right, that asset should be worth at least $100,000 or more, because a completed home is worth more than a home that's not built. So, you should, if you've done it right, have a home that's worth, over $100,000. That's great. The thing is the $100,000 you spent in building that home didn't just disappear. It went into the pockets of the contractors and the suppliers and everybody else who helped you build the home. In that way, wealth is created, right? The $100,000 that you spent didn't go away. It still exists in the economy. But you invested $100,000. You got back an asset that's worth at least the same amount while distributing that $100,000 to other people. Billionaires do the same thing. If you're a billionaire founder of some company, presumably you employed other people along the way. Presumably you bought supplies from other companies. You bought services from other people and companies and produced commerce for them. I would challenge you. I'm not sure that it's possible. Even the evilest billionaire that you could think of, like the evilest, creepiest billionaire that you could ever possibly think of, who lied and cheated and exploited all their way, even that person, and I'm not condoning that sort of behavior, but even that person cannot have become a billionaire without having created some wealth and prosperity and jobs and commerce for other people as well. Now, I'm not saying that's licensed to go out and bribe and cheat and steal and everything else. Of course, you shouldn't do that. I'm just saying, I don't know that it's possible to be successful and reach the point where you're a millionaire or a billionaire without creating opportunities and wealth for other people. And so when I hear leftist people saying, well, we should make it illegal to be a billionaire, we should make it illegal, we should lop the heads off the 1%, figuratively, or maybe not so figuratively in the ideas of some of these extremists. But I mean, if that's their idea, I don't know who that's going to help. Right? I mean, if anything, it's just going to be a warning out to the most successful, the brightest, the most, the most industrious among us, and tell us, hey, there's a ceiling on how successful you can be. If you get too successful, we're going to come after you with pitchforks and torches. I don't think that's such a good thing in society. But then the other side of the coin is, who does it help? I mean, okay, let's say, for instance, we go to Mark Zuckerberg and we confiscate 90% of his wealth, which, by the way, a lot of it's probably stock that he owns in various companies. I mean, a lot of it's probably assets. But let's just imagine that Mark Zuckerberg's wealth is all that Scrooge McDuck pile of wealth sitting in a vault somewhere. Let's say that we just seize all of that money and we redistribute it to the masses. Well, what did we help? I mean, I guess maybe for a while people can have that money, but in the long run, if they can't generate that sort of revenue for themselves, what good did it do? It gets back to that parable about, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. That's kind of what's going on here. I mean, I guess you could redistribute the wealth of the people at the top, but really I think what we should be concerned with is allowing people to access prosperity for themselves at the bottom, right? We don't need to push wealth back down from the bottom. What we need is more ladders to help people get up to that level themselves. Not that we're going to reach a point where everybody's a billionaire, but as the numbers that I read to you earlier in this rant, we're doing that. We've been pretty good at creating ladders to help people move up the income ladder. We've done pretty good. And a lot of that has to do with better access to education. A lot of that has to do with more liberalized economies throughout the world. I mean, here in the United States of America, we've doing a pretty good job of a generally free market economic environment for a long time now, but a lot of places in the world weren't like that. They had corrupt governments. They had authoritarian governments. You weren't necessarily free to be an entrepreneur, to go out there and have, a stable environment to operate in and a stable currency to deal with and a stable and generally uncorrupted court system in which to settle disputes and uncorrupted law enforcement to protect you from criminals. The fact that more places are becoming like that and are embracing free market, saying, you're a free person and you have rights and you're free to pursue your prosperity. I mean, those are the things that are going to allow people to lift themselves out of poverty. Believe it or not, and I realize that this is anathema to the sort of person who likes Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or what have you, but the reality is the free market is the best way to help people lift people out of poverty and into the middle class, not lopping the heads off billionaires. Although lopping the heads off billionaires is probably sexier politics. It's going to get you more headlines. It's going to inspire more think pieces in the New Yorker or the New York Times or what have you. I mean, it's catnip for a certain faction of the American body politic, but as practical public policy, it's not really going to accomplish anything. I mean, if anything, what it's going to do is it's going to drive the best and brightest away from America. One of the things that we opening our doors, I mean, a lot of people throughout history have come to the United States of America to pursue their dreams, to pursue wealth. I mean, there's a reason why the United States of America, despite having a relatively small population compared to places like China or India, has a disproportionate amount of the world's GDP is produced right here. And that's because of, not because we've been punishing billionaires or millionaires or saying that somebody's too rich and we ought to take them down a peg, not because of this sort of economic populist idea. And I would even go so far, if I may dare be critical of President Trump, not because of his economic populism or protectionism either. It's because generally we've taken a hands-off approach and we've allowed people to pursue their own prosperity. And it turns out most people are pretty good at that. And then you get that rare person who's really talented, who really has a good idea, who can, capitalize on it and turn it into $1 billion. I don't want to live in a world where we're punishing people, where we're putting some ceiling and saying, some threshold, whether it's $1 billion or wherever we want to draw the line in the sand and say, that's too rich. I don't want to live in that world. I don't think that's a very good world to live in. My interview with Congressman Kelly Armstrong next, and stay tuned after the interview for some listener feedback. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. Congressman Kelly Armstrong joins me now. Kelly, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Rob. Thanks for having me.
How's Congress so far?
Busy. Right now we got a lot of groups from North Dakota in, so we're trying to take as many meetings of that as possible. Committees are full swing, both in judiciary and oversight. So State of the Union in between this week, and we've just had a really busy week, but we're trying to get some work done.
Yeah, let's start there with the State of the Union. What'd you think of that?
I thought President Trump gave a great speech. I thought the witnesses he chose, or the guests he chose to recognize, showed that the greatness in America truly is its people and not its government. And I just thought it was a very good and actually hopeful speech. Also, at the same time, I mean, President Trump, he doesn't shy away from the things we disagree on. He confronts them head on, but also gave a path forward to work work towards a future in a divided government. So.
I've heard a lot of people say that when President Trump stays on message, when he sticks to the teleprompter, I think is how I've heard people say it, that he does a lot better than when he decides to improvise. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, first of all, I don't think he ever sticks to the teleprompter. I mean, the chamber of the U.S. House of Representatives broke out into Happy Birthday for a World War II vet. He had some good give and take, actually the most I've ever seen in a State of the Union with some Democrats in the audience. But so, I mean, he did a great job.
Let me ask you, speaking of President Trump, you got appointed to a House committee that's going to be investigating him. And obviously your chamber now under Democratic control, and we know how the Democrats feel about investigating President Trump. What are your thoughts on this committee? And you actually requested to be on this committee. Like, you asked for this and you got it. What's this committee going to do? Describe this for us.
Well, I don't think it's just this committee. I think there are different Democratic chairmen across a branch of committees that are all fighting to do whatever they think they can do to draw first blood on the Trump administration. Actually in Judiciary, we're supposed to have Acting Attorney General Whitaker testify on Friday, and he's agreed to testify. He's been invited to testify and agreed to testify, and they're going to subpoena him anyway, which is essentially unheard of down here. But yeah, I mean, government oversight, I'm on the subcommittee on environment. I think that's really important. Obviously, the industries that are important in North Dakota are coal, oil, ag, and I'm the new Green Deal resolution came out today. So oversight is not supposed to be solely about the president, although I have a feeling that we will be down that road a lot. And I think government gets sidetracked when we have personal grudges and continue to do those things as opposed to the work the committee should be doing.
So, I mean, basically, you're on an oversight committee, but you just feel Democrats are going to focus a lot on President Trump. I mean, I feel the same way when I hear them talk, when I look at their press releases. That just seems to be their priority right now is get Trump.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's almost unprecedented in its aggressiveness towards an administration, and I just don't think that. I don't think they'll be able to help themselves, which is really too bad, because oversight also deals with how the federal government interacts with state governments and where government can become more efficient. And those are the things we should be talking about in the committee. However, I think we will be issuing, my guess is there will be subpoena after subpoena issued to the Trump administration to essentially go on a witch hunt.
Now, you said just before we started our interview, you said that you've been doing some committee work in your Judiciary Committee on voting rights and also universal background checks. Tell us what's going on there.
Yeah, actually, we've had a hearing on the essentially Democrats, for a lack of a better way, want to bring California voting law to the entire country. It was interesting because we had it both in Judiciary and then we had it in oversight this week. And I got to inform some people about something they didn't know, and that North Dakota is the only state without voter registration, and this bill would actually make it harder to vote in North Dakota, not easier. Well,
that's interesting. What about the universal background checks?
Yeah, I mean, you can go back to the Obama administration and everything, and pretty much anybody who's ever studied this issue from the pro-gun control side has said none of this stuff works without a universal registry. This bill doesn't have it, but what this bill does do, you can tell who writes the exceptions to these things, that they've never spent time in the outdoors, in a rural state like North Dakota. The bill, as written, essentially makes federal felons out of every ranch kid who goes out with his buddy and lets him borrow his gun when they're maybe sighting in a rifle in a stubble field. It's a terrible piece of legislation. It's not going to solve any gun crime or any gun violence at all. And like I said, it's going to create a whole new class of felons, just people who live and work in rural North Dakota and rural America.
You're going to be coming on the podcast weekly now, and it's sort of a tradition I started with Senator Kramer, who of course does it with other hosts as well, of radio shows or whatever. And he comes on and he just takes questions every week. And we're going to be doing that. I'm going to be soliciting questions on Facebook, on social media. Also, people can email me their questions. Whenever it occurs to you, whip out your smartphone, send me the email. The next time Kelly's on, I'll ask him the question. And this is going to be happening every week. And we'll be recording these on Thursdays, but they'll be airing on or distributed on Fridays. That's sort of the schedule we'll try to stick to. And I do have some questions for you, Kelly. So if you're ready, we'll get right into them.
Absolutely.
All right. So Carol from Facebook asks, ask him if he had to sign an agreement yet to be loyal to Israel per the AIPAC and ADL. They always put the fear in our congressmen.
I have not signed any agreement like that, although I do support Israel. We have a great partnership. They are our biggest ally and our best ally in the Middle East. And I think there is a whole lot of anti-Semitic sentiment running around this place that I think should disturb anybody.
Nick asks, during the campaign, one of Congressman Armstrong's talking points was that we need to stop governing by crisis, particularly as it relates to the appropriations deadlines and seemingly constant threat of shutting down the government. President Trump's State of the Union address earlier this week delivered a refreshing message of compromise. This all sounds great, but without action, it's just talk. My question is, what happens now? What are the practical, concrete steps to compromise?
Well, I think the conference committee being named, particularly on funding for the border wall, which is the crisis point of the week, obviously. But I mean, compromise involves both parties, and I think that's where we're at right now. The Democratic leadership in the House has to recognize that they don't control the Senate and they don't control the White House, and they have to be willing to actually compromise. And I don't think it does a ton of good for any voter across the entire country when the conferees haven't even had their first meeting yet, and the Speaker of the House is coming out and drawing hard lines in the sand on particular issues. So hopefully they'll understand we need to continue to work forward. There are some bills, both in the Senate and the House, that deal with shutdowns, and I think there's some merit to some of those. The big issue with any bill that would avoid a shutdown when we have these crises that pop up is all branches of government need to feel the pain equally. Otherwise, one group would have a significant advantage in these negotiations as opposed to the other group.
That is interesting what you just said, because we live in such an instantaneous age, right, where something happens and then immediately people are reacting to it. We've got hot takes all over social media, and politicians are doing it as much as everybody else. And I think that's hard, because if something comes out and then immediately you just come out forcefully against it and you use, for instance, Speaker Pelosi saying that a wall is immoral. Well, if that's her standpoint, how in the world do you ever compromise from there? Right? I think it really creates a lot of problems.
Well, I agree with that, and especially considering that in their own words, they have supported these things in not too distant of a past. That's what I think is probably the most frustrating thing for me, just as a person, not even as a congressman, is that everybody forgets. I mean, and you're right, it doesn't matter what the issue is, but it comes out on social media. People react to it instantaneously. They don't take any time to vet the information. And then there's no consequences to either the hypocrisy or just moving on to the next thing. We try not to do that here. I just believe that there's too many people that are working too hard to get instant clicks, and I would prefer to actually know what happened before we comment on it.
Derek asks via Facebook, does he support Trump bypassing Congress to get the wall built if Democrats refuse to compromise via his emergency powers?
I support President Trump getting the wall built. I think that conversation gets a little problematic just on separation of powers. And while you might support it for one particular issue, I worry about what happens the next time there's a Democrat in the White House or an ideologue that I completely disagree with. So I'd have to say I'd have to see the legal reasoning as to why it's appropriate and be ensured that it wouldn't be abused.
Continuing, another question from Facebook. Will he support efforts to reschedule or completely legalize marijuana nationally?
Probably not completely legalize it, mostly because I don't think that has any real head steam to pass out here. But I do think we need to reschedule it out of a Class 1 narcotic. And the reason so being is the federal government has essentially taken to ostriching on marijuana policy. And what I mean by that is it's still at the federal level, it's still considered every bit as dangerous as cocaine, crack, methamphetamine, or heroin. but we've allowed so many states to legalize it. And we're starting to see some real world problems with that outside of medicinal use, recreational use, and companies that do business in so many different states are starting to have to write new human resource manuals in every single state they do business in. All the while, there's federal banking connotations and federal, like, insurance for drivers. And it's really causing a problem, not just as just bad policy, but also for real world application to our businesses across the country.
Another question from Facebook: would he support a national voter registration system to help eliminate fraud in national elections?
No, I won't support that. I think voting is a perfect example of what should be done at the state level. Right now, we have auditors and legislators from the Bismarck-Burleigh County area having a debate in the North Dakota legislature about some voting issues. And I just feel like when those national laws come into place, rural states who deal with things in a very different way, like complete vote by mail counties, have boilerplate federal legislation forced down their throat, and these decisions should be made at the local level.
Via Twitter,
there are no national there are no national elections. There are just national. There are local elections to elect national representatives.
Via Twitter, Luke asks, are you going to be part of the Freedom Caucus? If no, why not?
I'm not as of this point, although I will tell you Jim Jordan is the ranking member on oversight, and I have had several meetings with Mark Meadows, and he also serves on oversight. They've been gracious in providing us background on some of the things we're going to do. They are tremendous advocates for this administration and for the rule of law, and so I anticipate working closely with them on these issues. We serve on the same committee. I'm on both committees with Jim Jordan, and we communicate almost daily, and he's been fantastic.
Clark via Twitter asks, regarding the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, what is the ideological argument for government intervention and collective payment with some healthcare needs but not others? Government mandated intervention with emergencies and prenatal, but not other health issues.
Well, the federal government's role in any kind of murder case is fairly limited, and one would argue that Roe v. Wade changed the game on that when it came to abortion. Whether you agree with the decision or disagree with this decision, that's how the game has changed. So by the ruling in Roe v. Wade, the federal government has a role to play in abortion as it relates to this. And this is an important issue. And it's not. I'm a pro-life guy, but this isn't even a pro-life argument. This is a human decency argument. We are having conversations about babies that are being born alive, and regardless of how that works, it's something that deserves protection.
Well, Kelly, that's all the questions I have. Thanks for your time.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
The sad music means the Plain Talk podcast is over today, but before we go, some listener feedback. The first comes from Curtis, who is responding to my interview with Senator Kevin Cramer yesterday, who answered some questions about donating his salary during the government shutdown. Now, if you haven't been following the story, Senator Cramer does not donate his salary. The other two members of North Dakota's federal delegation do, Senator Hoeven and Congressman Kelly Armstrong. Cramer does not, and he hasn't done it during previous shutdowns when he was in the United States House, and he's not doing it now that he's in the Senate. He said that he doesn't feel it's a particularly noble thing to do, and he doesn't see the point, and it's grandstanding. Curtis responds with this email. He says, I quote, Senator Cramer was not born with a silver spoon in mouth, while the other two were. Yes, Senator Hoeven and Congressman Armstrong have worked very hard with both making impressive accomplishments in their careers. Nevertheless, both did get huge boosts from family, wealth, and notoriety along every step of the way, where, like me, Senator Cramer has had to dig and claw his way through every step of the way in earning his career accomplishments and wealth. Unlike the other gentleman, I do not believe Senator Cramer has been or ever will be the fortunate recipient of parental wealth. It's easy to give up a six-figure salary when your net worth is in the millions. I admire all three gentlemen, but also find it to be political grandstanding for our elected officials to rub it in our face that, hey, look at me, I'm so wealthy, I can work for free. Then I have to ask, who are they really working for? And what else motivates them to work for nothing? I would like to believe the cause is noble, but then again, I've lived too many decades of life to know things are seldom what they appear, in America's political arena. I think Curtis has a point. I agree with Senator Kramer that the grandstanding is it's grandstanding. I think donating your salary during a government shutdown does nothing to address the reason why the government is shut down. It's symbolic. And as Senator Kramer said yesterday, money's fungible. So there's nothing to say that people can't just, these wealthy people who no doubt also already make a lot of charitable donations can't just shift some of those things around and donate the same amount of charity that they normally do. And Senator Kramer also has made this point in the past as well. Congress is still working during the shutdown, right? Congress is still working. They're still trying to hammer out deals. I don't like that the government shut down. I don't think anybody wants the government to be shut down. But Congress is still working. Why shouldn't they collect their pay? I think the whole thing is political theater. The next bit of feedback comes from Avery on Twitter. They write, no, Senator Kramer, you definitely are not noble. Sucked in reference was classic spin for the fact Trump wasn't even thinking of the fact many women were elected because voters are repelled by him. He stepped into that one, that listener, responding to Senator Kramer's basically saying that Trump sucked in some of the women who were cheering during his State of the Union speech. So I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know if he sucked them in. It was a little funny, though. I mean, it's of all the rhetoric about how President Trump is this hateful, awful, sexist person. And then he had a bunch of women wearing white, Democratic women, liberal women, dancing on the floor of the House of Representatives during his State of the Union speech. I don't know. It looked like a good moment to the president for me. All right, that's it for today's show. Remember, if you want to send any feedback on the show, you can email me, rob@sayanythingblog.com, or find me on social media. I'm at Rob Port on Twitter. At Say Anything Blog is the blog feed on Twitter. You can find both the blog and me on Facebook as well. We put up, I link to all the episodes of the podcast via those social media accounts. So if you want to follow the podcast that way, you certainly can. All new episodes of the podcast are also put up on sayanythingblog.com if you want to listen that way. Or if you want to subscribe, you can find me wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever. If you have any problems subscribing anywhere, you can't find the podcast on a platform, email me, rob@sayanythingblog.com. And feel free to get in touch with me. I like to be interactive. I like it when people say hi. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.